Welcome to the Storypowers Podcast, the show about the power of stories, the people who tell them, and why you should be doing it too. I'm your host, keynote speaker and storytelling coach, Francisco Mahfuz. My guest today is Norman Bell. Norman is a storytelling and presentation coach, award winning speaker, theater, and film actor. He's passionate about helping purpose driven entrepreneurs and organizations tell stories to connect with their audiences on an emotional level, which leads to more clients, more donations, and more impact. Even though Norman has written and performed in successful one man shows, has acted alongside Christian Bale, it's clear that all his life and work have brought him to this moment. Because the author of a book called The Story Powered Speaker is now a guest at the Story Powers podcast. And if that's not proof we all have a destiny, I don't know what is. Ladies and gentlemen, Norman Bell. Norman, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Francisco. It's a pleasure to be here. Yes, thank you.
Should we start by settling the copyright issue, that the one that you might know about and the one you might not know about?
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Right. So I don't know if you've actually copyrighted this thing, but I haven't actually bothered copywriting Story Powers as one word. Do you have you copyrighted Story Powered the way you write it?
I haven't, and I've seen some other companies in other parts of the world use the phrase "story
Mm.
powered" before. Actually, I haven't seen
Yes.
"story powers."
Mm.
So yeah, I on my end, I have no issues. I hadn't even really thought about it, but yes, we can discuss this more if needed. But
No,
I'm cool
I'm
with
kidding. I'm
it.
not really bothered. I mean, I know there is some German guy who seems to have a podcast called Story Powers, but I think the company you might be talking about is one I'm very familiar with, which is Anecdote. So
Oh yeah.
Anecdote, they're a story consultancy, and they have copyrighted the term. I think it's story powered with a hyphen, story powered sales and story powered leadership or something like
Yeah.
that. And but yeah, I mean, I think unless you use it in that exact configuration, who cares, right?
Sure, I'll look that up afterwards, and I know they're in Australia, so I don't know if there's anything there. But anyway, yeah.
Yes, yes, and I do find that it's somewhat amusing, to me at least, that today, there is this name coincidence between the stuff we're doing. And 2 weeks ago, I had a guest on the podcast that has the same name as me, or
Oh,
my surname Mahfuz is his first name. So it was very
oh.
strange because often throughout the conversation I would say Mahfuz, and I was like, why am I talking to myself? It wasn't-
Mahfuz meet Mr. Mahfuz. Yeah.
Yes, Mahfuz, you're full of crap. Oh, hold on. That was for me, not for him. So anyway, it gets confusing. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to ask you about was about this thing you call the mango effect. Okay,
Oh,
now I'm not, I it's a common concept in storytelling, but I like how you branded it that. So can you just talk a bit about what the hell that is and what you mean by the mango effect?
yeah, yeah. So one of the most powerful examples I have experienced of regarding the power of storytelling is when I was a solo theater performer. And, I've done a variety of different shows. I did for example, a full length solo performance about the subprime mortgage meltdown, where I played like 11 different characters, and people were like, "Oh, that's the first time I really understood what happened."
And
So
it was before The Big Short, right? Big Short is 2010, and your
yeah,
thing was Subprime was 2009, wasn't it?
that's right. That's right. I probably could have pushed it a little bit more to get to Broadway or something before The Big Short came
Mm.
out, but yeah, it's a kind of this in the same vein there. Um, and The Big Short has Christian Bale, who I played opposite for this scene in The Machinist. But anyway, that's another story. But I did a short solo performance one time. It was just maybe 10 or 15 minutes. Very simple story about my tempestuous relationship with an 18-pound curmudgeon of a cat named Mango. So I'm not talking about the fruit, the mango. I'm talking about a cat, this orange cat, Mango. And when we when we first met, we hated each other. I would come into the room and he would growl at me. I would growl back at him. Um, but then after a period of time, an unlikely thing happened, which was that we kind of fell in love with each other. And one morning, I found him kneading on my chest and giving me some love and blinks. And I found myself, being silly with animals the way that we are, and like, oh, come here and give me a cuddle, you cuddly man, And then, our hearts kind of opened up to each other, and then, unfortunately, about 6 months later, he got sick and he died, and so the piece that I performed was just a simple story about kind of acting out what I just said there, and just sort of the journey from hating each other, loving each other, and then feeling heartbroken after he died. And it was such a, and I should note also, maybe when I was first developing the piece, there was a lot more to it. There was like, I had all this stuff about, oh, the universe. Hey, did you know that the universe was the size of a marble when it first started? And then it was kind of conceptual things. And then the story of Mango was just a piece of that. But my wife, as I was kind of performing it for her, she's my sometimes director. She was like, the only part that about this that's really resonating is the part about Mango. And so we stripped away everything else, and I just told that story. And it had a really powerful effect on certain people in the audience, right? Uh, uh, and they would come up to me after the show, sometimes with tears in their eyes, and they would show me pictures of their animals that had passed. Oh, this is my dog Coco that died 2 years ago, and I heard this phrase over and over again. I really related to your story, and so that was just one of those times where, one, I saw this example of when I had all these big ideas, and that I wanted to get across, but those weren't really landing. And when I stripped it away and told a simple human story that was emotional at its core, that was what really resonated. And so, yeah, that's the Mango effect, is sort of when you tell a story that really connects with people on an emotional level, and you hear that phrase, you're like, I really related to your story, then you've connected with someone.
Well, I really related to this story because my wife is also sometimes my director, even though I
Oh,
don't
okay.
act. She's just
Yeah.
my boss. She's like, no, that doesn't
Yeah.
work. Stop doing
Yeah.
it. Stop making the joke.
Yeah.
No,
Take that
but
out.
really,
Yeah.
I do really relate to the story because I remember a few years ago when I was in one of those, Toastmasters competitions. I did a
Mm,
speech. They got me, I think, second place at national level, and it was about my dog. And I remember the very first time I gave the speech outside of a competition, I I gave the speech, and like with any animal story, the animal dies at the end,
yeah.
and the person who went up on stage to evaluate my speech, which, for anyone who doesn't know, in Toastmasters is a public speaking club, and usually some people give speeches, the other people go up there and give them constructive feedback. And this guy went up there, and like, I almost cried during my speech. And then he gets up to the evaluation, and he starts kind of catch words start catching in his throat, and he's like, I just really miss my dog too.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And then it was the same. And I did a competition. I had people coming up to me. It was like, this was my dog, this was my cat.
Oh, okay.
um
Okay. So you've had the
uh,
same experience. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's worth it, that if you ever, or worth remembering, if you ever do a workshop or a presentation for about this in Europe, remember that when you say the mango effect, a lot of people are going, what, the clothing brand? The one that has,
Oh,
Gerard Piqué and Zinedine
the mango
Zidane,
effect.
as yes. And that's what I thought
Yeah.
was the mango effect. It's like, oh, this will be interesting. I didn't realize it's a cat.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll say not the clothing brand, but
Yeah.
the
So
18
okay,
pound
so
orange
so
cat. Yeah.
So when you share a story of loss, and loss of a pet, which is something I think most people can relate to, that's kind of obvious why that works.
Yeah.
But so, for example, when you do a story about subprime, now this is easier for people to understand because of The Big Short and how popular that movie was. But when you were figuring out the story of The Big Short, what were the relatable pieces in there?
Well, I actually worked. I mean, this was just like my normal career work has been in communications, whether it's been story, these now I'm doing storytelling, I've done copywriting and so forth. But I had a little uh, uh, detour into this world where I just come home. Actually, I don't think we've mentioned yet, Francisco, but I was living in Barcelona I lived in Barcelona for 5 years, actually not far from where it sounds like Francisco lives. But I came home to Seattle in 2004, and I needed a job, and I ended up working at this subprime mortgage. I mean, it was like a mortgage company, and so I wasn't a mortgage loan officer, but I was a. They called us JLOs, junior loan officers, and so I got
J-Lo's. Oh,
JLOs, yeah, like
Jesus.
Jennifer Lopez, right?
Yes.
But and it was just a crazy atmosphere. It was just sort of like, I actually I haven't seen The Big Short, so but I'm sure there's some of that in there. And just if you any movie you've seen about Wall Street or whatever, you can maybe kind of imagine just a really hyped up atmosphere. And so a lot of the play was based on my own experiences, and then the latter half that then I had some kind of a fictional customer that kind of got brought into the like the problems that they had as a result of getting into this, and some of the loan officers were based on people that I had met there. So yeah, it was the easiest was to write the things that I experienced myself, obviously.
Yeah, because this is something I mean I fully believe in this, and I think this is the great talent that people like Michael Lewis, who easily one of the best, written storytellers out there for sure, or Malcolm Gladwell, do, which is uh, you can make just about anything sound interesting
Mm.
if you find some character in there that it's relatable, and
Yeah,
you tell it with enough details that it feels like a real life experience that you're reading or watching.
yeah,
And I don't I because of the types of stories I often tell, I don't believe in this thing that it needs to be an exciting. The thing itself needs to be exciting for it to make for an exciting story. And I was just a few minutes before we started. I was finishing a presentation to Hewlett Packard, and I have a whole bunch of corporate stories in there. But I had a story about my kid going to school in Barcelona and finding it strange that people spoke funny because it's a local school, they speak Catalan, and she didn't at the time. I had a
uh,
story about my wife leaving her job, or getting out of her job and being kind of screwed by her boss. And I had a story about me not being the best of fathers and trying to find a different way to do that. And on the surface of it, none of those stories are terribly exciting. I mean, there's barely much happening in those stories. But I would argue that because if the character is relatable enough, and I'm making it seem like an action scene, something that actually happened, then you leave it through with me, and you get the emotion, and you get the value out of a story like that. But that's why I
mhm.
thought it was pretty interesting that you had a subprime show.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
hmm.
Yeah, well, and I would say for everything that you just mentioned, I mean, one of the things one of my tips in my book is to kind of get in trouble. And that, if you think about any movie you've seen, any book you've read, and I know from the theater world, that conflict is at the center of every story. And, I use Star Wars as an example, is something we probably, most of us know, and one of my favorite stories. And of course, we don't have space battles in our own lives, or Darth Vader or the Death Star, but we do have our own, and it can be big trouble or little trouble, right? And so, just even in the examples you just mentioned there, it was sort of like, well, your child went to school, and why do they speak? funny. So that was something challenging or a slight different, something that a minor obstacle that your child had to overcome, and in the other examples as well. And so when I in my workshops, I usually ask people to start with thinking of some turning point moments in their lives. So, because stories are often about challenges, but also about change, where something changed for you, that either got better or worse, could be a big change or a little change. But those are often good places to start.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. In my core, like the online course that I've got, and in trainings I've given, the three things I tell people to look for when they're looking for their origin story are almost exactly what you said: challenge, change, and then the third one I call kung fu moments. And this
Mm.
is, take your pick. Could either be I was thinking of the Matrix when Neo gets all the uploads and says, "I know kung fu." That moment of realization where you have a power that you didn't have before.
Yeah.
But it works perfectly well for Kung Fu Panda as well. So
Right.
it's
Right.
so yeah. So I fully agree with you there. And on the subject of origin stories, which is something I work with my clients too. Origin stories work really, really well for speakers. They work really well for entrepreneurs. They work really well for people that in a way are on their own. At least that's been my experience. Have you found that there is some way to use origin stories when people work for larger organizations? If you're not the founder, I mean.
Yeah, I've been working with organizations lately and focusing. There's so many different stories. Actually, there's the author Paul Smith. I'm trying to remember the names
I,
of
I
his.
had I had I had him on. Yeah,
Oh, you
yeah,
had him on. Great, great.
yeah, yeah,
So, the 10 stories that, leaders should tell. I forget the exact
yeah,
title of his book, but so
yeah.
that's a good place to start. It's a short book, actually. So I'd recommend checking
Mhm.
that out. Out of those, I have focused recently on three stories for organizations: who I am, that's kind of the origin story. Who we are, sort of a culture and values story, like who are we collectively? What do we stand for? And then where we're going is sort of the vision story of where we're headed. And I found that to be helpful. There is. Yeah, I'm not going to remember the name. There's somebody else that has a similar framework. And basically, yeah, it was called like the story of self, the story of us, and the
Mm.
story of now. And that story of now is sort of like, why do we take action now? Marshall Gans, he's from Harvard or something like that. So I should probably have these names ready at the ready. But and the who I am story is really your personal why story, right? And everybody in the organization needs to have their own why, like what motivates them personally, and it may go back before your time in the company. It might go back to childhood. Who knows? This is why I like to look through the turning point moments, because it might not be the story you think it is, until you start to kind of dig for some story gold. And then the who we are story is in an organization I worked with recently, a healthcare organization. It was really stories of like how people were showing up for work. Here's some of the values that we've identified that we stand for in this organization. But it's one thing to say, oh yeah, we stand for generosity or dedication, etc. Those are just words. But if you can back those up with a story, for example, last Thanksgiving, one of the doctors, this is, I mean, vaguely based on what came out of that, came in and did two overnight shifts to, help with the overload of patients because of the COVID pandemic. So, so stories related to that kind of illustrate those values. And then the really interesting conversation, sometimes there's people in different parts, leaders in different parts of the organization that are siloed and don't get a chance to really talk to each other. But then, in some of the conversations, they were getting excited about, this is where I see where our organization is going as far as the new technology we're using. Here's how we can reach out to the community, et cetera, et cetera. And if you can start to coalesce that into a kind of a vision story for the organization, that can be effective. Hope that answered your
Yeah,
question.
so the vision, no, it does, it does. The vision story I find a bit trickier. I know
Yeah.
Poe's approach, or at least one of his approaches, is kind of interesting, where he says, as he's told people to, what was it? Just get the magazine your CEO likes to read,
Mm.
and sort of write an article as if it was in the like in Forbes, right? So write the article telling the story of the success your company has, or the department has, or the project has had, but write it as if it's in the future, right? So
Yeah.
you don't have to like tell, this is what's going to happen. You actually tell as if this has
Yeah.
happened last year, and you
Yeah.
just putting down on a magazine, which I think is interesting. But I'm always sort of in the back foot with some of those, because I don't know to what extent the it just, to me, just becomes fiction, right? So that's the thing I struggle with, because I've seen a lot of people teaching how you write one of these vision stories, or future stories, or customer stories, instead of just finding one that's real, instead of finding one that, you can't have the vision story before something happen, but you can have little things that have started happening,
Yeah.
that are, on the same path, or things like what you're trying to do, that have happened. As an
Yeah.
example, I've tended to think that just, it's still a real story. You just positioning in a way of, this is the beginning of what we're trying to achieve, or this is like what we're trying to achieve, instead of an exercise in fiction. But yeah, Paul swears by that one, and he's one of the good ones. So
Oh, yeah.
I'm not
Yeah.
gonna
Yeah, yeah,
I'm not gonna
absolutely,
say anything
absolutely. I
against
I think
him.
that's a great approach that he suggested. I always look for, I talk about in my book sort of there's sort of the horizontal axis of story, sort of the future and past, but then there's also the presence, kind of the vertical axis of the teller, right? And so I pay attention to that piece as well, and I always look for stories that come alive, and so whether they're stories from our past or something that people are getting excited about in the future, and I'm thinking of this workshop that I just referred to, that there were certain moments when this woman was talking about the technology they use in this healthcare organization, where, like, I didn't know anything about that technology, nor am I that interested in it, but I sure wanted to know more about it after she talked about it, because she was super excited, right? So it's like finding those things that are legitimately um, that you're excited about, that animate your body when you start talking about them. And I think that's one of the things that I look for with story gold. And I think you're right, though, that it should, if you're doing a vision story, if it's not something that people can really relate to on an emotional level, then it'll just seem like an idea versus something that's really motivating.
So you talked about, things that, make you come alive, and I think that's a nice lead into something I'm very curious about, which is that a lot of people love talking about how storytelling, great storytelling, has to do with, the hero's journey, and a lot of the techniques that are used in movies, like, most of the Pixar movies, yeah, use stuff like that. Now, you've done acting in different capacities. You've been involved with big Hollywood movies. How, knowing what you know now, how much is that connection kind of an obvious one, when you look back into some of the cinema work you've done? Can you look back at those scripts and go, yeah, I can see exactly what they were doing, there was a clear formula here? Or the truth is slightly more complicated and messy than what some people want to make it sound like?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, and I don't want to overplay my film experience. I think my 1 minute of film fame was in this movie, The Machinist. Actually, it was filmed in Barcelona. They
Was it? I
It
had no
was,
idea.
yeah.
Wow.
They put up signs to make it look like it was LA, Los Angeles or something, but
Poor
I
man.
don't know.
He, all this lovely food here, and Christian Bale was, weighed something like 80 pounds or something ridiculous.
Yeah, yeah, he lost, 60, yeah, whatever it was, a ton of weight to play this part, and nobody asked him to. That's the kind of actor he is. He's just sort of like all in, he's I think one of our best. Um, but yeah, so I've been in that. I was actually in a Spanish soap opera when I was in Barcelona. Some of this is just coming to mind now. Um, but I'm a theater guy. I think at heart, even though obviously there's more money to be made in film and commercials and TV and so forth. But this whole idea of a performance coming to life or a story coming to life, I find easier to do in the theater when it's sort of the space is sort of built for that, right? In film, but then there's somebody like Christian Bale. We could use him as an example, as someone who is so dedicated to their role as an actor that they are that person, right? I'm sure there's some other actors you can think of, your favorites, that Marlon Brando comes to mind, or somebody like that. um but I just find that in the film world it's harder to kind of do that because there's so many constraints, and then they're looking to film things from different angles, and a lot of there's a lot of technical stuff going on, that can sometimes the directors don't allow the space for those kind of performances. So that's all the better when it's all the more amazing when it comes through. I'm thinking of the Lord of the Rings. We just binge watched the Lord of the Rings again recently, and that's such an amazing technical feat, and yet the performances are so amazing as well. So
I have a problem with a lot of the rings. I think it's. I mean, I love the books, even though the first book can be one of the most boring things you ever read, with all the
Tom,
descriptions of shrubbery. But
Tom
which,
Bombadil, yeah, detour
yes,
there, yeah.
yes,
Uh-huh.
yeah. Then I'm not sure I can say shrubbery without remembering Monty Python. But my problem with the Lord of the Rings, and this is perhaps more blatant in the books than it is in the movie, is how I find Aragorn such an
Mm,
unrelatable character. He,
mm,
but almost. I mean, they're entertaining and they're fun, but none of them, apart with maybe the Hobbits, they're not almost not fallible at all.
mhm.
Legolas is a archery killing machine. Aragorn doesn't seem to be in any danger throughout any of the three movies, really. Gimli is the comic relief, which is, it's one of those movies. As an example, I think if you didn't have the Hobbits, the movie just wouldn't work at all. It,
Yeah,
it, it would essentially
yeah.
be like a James Bond or Fast and Furious type of movie, but with orcs, right? Which
Yeah, yeah,
actually
I
doesn't sound
mean,
like the worst idea ever.
yeah, yeah, I mean, hey, that could be fun, yeah. Um,
Fast and
and then
Furious, but with
obviously
orcs.
they
Yes.
yeah, and then you could go into the Hobbit trilogy as even a level like, oh my god, that for me that just didn't work
Yeah.
at all. But well,
No.
I don't know how far down the rabbit hole you want to go here, but yeah, I think in the book Aragorn really seemed like, well, he already even had the sword or whatever that, and it was already super confident, and I could see in the movies they were trying to give him a bit of an arc where he was unsure about whether he was going to follow the same path as Isildur, and cave in at the end, and they I think they try to show like, oh no, he's taking a different path. But I hear what you're saying, yeah. But in the meantime, I would say what really resonates with me, what on an emotional level, is Sam. Like Sam's journey. It seems like it's going to be about Frodo, but Frodo's so busy being possessed by the ring that it's really Sam in the end it's so heroic. So, but anyway, I could talk about that for a while.
Yeah, and a beautiful Hobbit to Hobbit romance that never came to pass on the
Yes,
screen, but,
yes, yes,
seemed pretty clear what they were going for
yes,
there.
yes.
Um, okay, so one of the other stories that you actually. I'll pin that. I'll come back to it. No, the reason I wanted to start talking about the acting you do was, one, because of plot and things of that nature that a lot of people love referring to cinema when they talk about storytelling. But the other thing is this idea you have in the book about acting out. Because perhaps because I've been exposed to too much Toastmasters in my life, but this is one of the things that I find one of the most common mistakes people make, either as speakers or as storytellers, is that they're not actors. They don't understand the concept of acting. So what they would do is they're acting out scenes like they were mimes
Oh
instead
yeah.
of people living it. So all of a sudden your
Yeah.
hand gestures become like, everything is, I was talking on the phone and then I got my
Oh.
gun, and
Oh
for people who
no.
can't watch, I'm just miming every single object I'm mentioning, and becomes a pantomime,
Oh yeah.
of, well, pantomime. But that's not, no one ever speaks that way, no one will ever tell a story to their friends at dinner that way. So I'm always concerned when any type of advice when it comes to stories suggests that people should act. So
Mm.
what exactly is your take on that?
Great question. Well, I always like to start with, to me, the most important part of the process, and it should be because this is where you find the stories that really resonate with you, is uncovering the stories, right? Digging for story gold. And so, again, I like to. There's a quote from a film director, John Frankenheimer, which is, uh, um, casting is 65% of directing. And what he means by that is if you find the right person for the role, you're going to have to work so much less, it'll be so much easier to get the performance you're looking for. And so I would say that's the truth with stories as well. If you can find the, if you, so in my process, as we're looking for story gold, we do some tryouts, auditions to see which stories are really resonating. And I'm always looking for that story that lights you up when you tell it. And then we apply the craft and then we fine tune it. And so, we're not starting with the hand. I'm an inside out guy as opposed to an outside in guy. And I know from studying acting, both ways are valid. They both can work. But I just tend to, and actually most of the acting,
So sorry, what do those things mean? Outside
yeah,
in, inside out.
outside in is kind of what you were describing there of like move your hand over here, then look, look concerned, whereas inside out is find a reason why you would be doing these things, right? And like what you're concerned, what are you concerned about, like you're legitimate, authentically concerned. And that's why you would show a concerned look. It's tricky. I mean, like acting, like I remember in the acting classes and so forth, there's a lot that goes into it, and sometimes it can go haywire as you tap into some old emotions or experiences, and crazy things can happen in an acting class. But I think just I'm always looking for that authentic, sort of an authentic, like what how do you authentically feel? Like tell me, like why do you do what you do? And if we can find that moment in your life where it was like, and a lot of times people have it like right there. It's like, I'll tell you why I do what I do. Because when I was 12 years old, a bully came up to me at school and XYZ, they tell that story. And that's that once there's that sort of conviction there, then the acting out piece is just sort of it's kind of icing on the cake. And so it's just sort of like, hey, when you did this already naturally, where you acted out the bully coming up to you on the playground and you said to him and you pointed. So just kind of getting a little bit more definition around those scenes, because we're always kind of looking to play out a scene so people can picture it in their mind. That's when storytelling can be most effective.
All right, so that's an important point, because I find that this is one of the things that people have the most difficulty with. It's
Mm.
this contrast between what you call narrative summary versus scenes. So
Oh yeah.
I normally refer to scenes as moments, And yeah, I would say, you have a moment and the rest is all, exposition or just narration, or you're telling, but I want you to show me.
Yeah.
And I find that some people grasp that context of the scene or the show me the moment fairly easily, and some people don't. Now, when you're doing workshops, how much you find that it's more one than the other?
Yeah, I was a participant at a workshop with a guy named Kevin Allison, and I think he comes from the improv world, but he also has a podcast called Risk, which is about telling kind of vulnerable stories. And he said that this is one of the common, I don't want to say mistakes, but one of the common things that beginning storytellers do is they'll spend most of their time or the majority of their time in narrative summary, which is sort of at the 30,000-foot view. And I'll have to come up with a better example than this because this is the one I keep using, but I need a more compelling one. But that would be like me saying, yeah, in about 10 years ago, I was working at the Goreflex Corporation. I was a copywriter and I had been working there for 5 years. So that's all high level, right? And then um scene. One night I'm late, I'm in the office. It's 10:30. There's nobody else in the office. It's quiet except for the sound of me clacking at the keyboard when suddenly I notice that there's a light on in the boss's office. And I hear a creaking sound, and then the sound of a baby crying. Right. So, I mean, again, I'll come up with some other scene another time. I'm getting tired of that one, but you can get the difference, right? Like one is this high level information that really doesn't conjure up any images in your mind. The other is we're on the ground with the storyteller in that situation, and your mind can almost not help but conjure up that situation. Even as I said that, you might have been imagining sitting in front of the computer in the dark and seeing a light and hearing a baby crying. So Kevin Allison said that, or I think in my book, I said, like we probably spend 70% of our time as beginning storytellers in narrative summary and 30% in scenes. And a goal to move towards is the reverse, maybe 30% narrative summary and 70% scenes, so that your narrative summary is kind of connectors, but from scene to scene to scene.
Yeah,
That's
the example I usually give to people to just make the difference is, I say, if you want to tell me how strange your childhood was, don't tell me how it was for years. Just tell me how it was for one Thanksgiving dinner. So, don't
absolutely.
say, "Oh, my family." Just say, "So it's Thanksgiving dinner last year, and I'm sitting down next to my brother, and then my
Yeah.
crazy uncle Kev comes in, and Kev looks at me
Yeah.
and says, so I find that, like, explaining that is, I find that fairly easy, and I tend to tell people the bigger one of the almost undeniable cases when you've gone from one to the other is dialogue. If you're telling me what the conversation was about, that's just a narration. When
Yeah.
you're actually saying, "So I looked at him and said," and you actually do the dialogue, then you're automatically into a scene. But even so, I find it very challenging with some people. They just keep resisting the scene. I don't know if
Yeah.
it's that they lack the resources to say, "Okay, well, how do I make it into a scene?"
Yeah.
um, and I just tend to say, well, try to tell it in the present tense if you don't find it too weird, and just do a lot of dialogue, because if you can do
Yeah.
that, then you can't avoid the scene or a moment if you're doing that. But it's one of the things most people, I find, struggle with.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, this is just like anything. Any of your listeners here. Well, if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably an avidly interested in storytelling. So maybe you're already practicing this, but it's not something you're going to pick up in after listening to a half-hour conversation or an hour conversation. It takes a lot of practice, right? And that's probably one of those things. if you're working with executives or people in the business world, this pushing their comfort zone is like, oh, I'm going to act out a conversation or something like that. But yeah, I would just say, encourage people to go there. Like the more that you're able to draw people into your story, and doing that is one way to do it. The more you're going to connect with them. I mean, we do this all the time anyway. Like, you don't need to be that's one thing I try to stress, is to demystify storytelling as if it was just something like you and I'm also a Toastmasters guy. So you and I are Toastmasters people, actors and so forth. It can sort of seem like, oh, that's a rarefied realm, storytelling. But no, we tell stories all the time. Right now, obviously we can't stand around the water cooler, or we're limited in doing that. But whether it's on Zoom or in person, anytime you answer the question, how was your weekend? You're going to be telling a story. It might not be a great story, actually, if everything goes well. I was like, yeah, I went to a party. It was great. Yeah, that's not a great story. Oh, I went to a party and you wouldn't believe what happened. Like, I show up and my ex-girlfriend is there. And I was like, oh my God, I haven't talked to her in 7 years. And she's got a really, angry look on her face. I mean, that's probably going to be a good story. And you
I find
probably
it
might act
surprising that
some of that out. Yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
Mhm. I find it surprising that even people like Toastmasters who speak on a regular basis, they still struggle with the concept of moments or scenes. Just
Mhm.
last week I had someone coming to me and saying, "Oh, I've got this storytelling project. Can you just give me a hand? Because this is what you do." And most of it was like, you know, so my father was like this, and my mother was
Mhm.
like that, and then
Mhm.
I stayed between the two of them, and
Mhm.
one would then say, so it's like it's all of that is you just, I mean, you're not that far away, so it's not, I don't think it's the 30,000 foot view, but you are just telling me what happened. You're not showing me any of it. And there is an analogy that I've gotten from Marsha Shandur, who's a storyteller I
Oh, yeah.
really like, and she describes it as movies, because the whole idea is, a good story is a movie in the minds of your audience. So it says, okay, so
Yeah.
imagine this as there's voiceover, there's voiceover, and there's voiceover, there's montage, and there is an action scene. So,
Mm.
a voiceover, it would be like an audiobook,
Mhm.
right? You're just telling everything, and you want to avoid that as much as you possibly can. The montage is when you just talk about 4 or 5 different things that you need to just set up in place so the story makes sense, but you're not going into any detail. So you're saying, I was traveling through Europe, and we went to Paris and visited the Eiffel Tower. We went to this other place, and we went running with the bulls. We really enjoyed some tapas in Barcelona. So that's all sort of a montage. A montage. It's a lot of really quick things. And then you say, but then when we arrived in Russia, I'm in the metro in Russia, and blah blah blah. All right, so she
Yeah.
goes from the montage to a scene. But yeah, to me that is one of the biggest challenges most people have with any story. The other challenge that I tend to find all the time is people can't figure out what their story. Either they can't figure out what their story is about,
Yeah.
or they figure it out but don't make sure that they drop a few things throughout the story to highlight that that's what the story is about. So the story is going to be about some big learning they had,
Yeah.
but at no point in the story you see them not knowing that thing. So, if I'm
Mm.
telling a story, say, about how I learned to communicate better with my daughter, what a lot of people I've worked with in the past would do is they just at some point get better at communicating with their kids, but at no point in the story they were terrible at it.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And then it
Uh-huh.
just doesn't
Uh-huh.
really work. Then the
Yeah.
message just finds it's like, okay, fine, you got a little better at something. Like,
Yeah.
there's not much of a story. And I was like, no, I
Yeah.
was terrible at it. It was like, but you didn't tell me that. Like, where's the awkward conversation you're having with your kid, or the blowout, or the fight?
Yeah.
It was just
Yeah.
not there at any point.
Yeah, yeah, that's the kind of the change and challenge we've talked about. and stakes, the more you can raise the stakes, that's always the, in acting class, or, in movies and stories in general, high stakes. By the way, we're all living in high stakes situation these days. So there's stories going on all around you. Surely you can probably, tell a story of the day, the first day the pandemic really hit you. For me, it was March 13th. I could tell you that story, but I won't. You probably don't need to hear more stuff about the pandemic. I was also going to say, like, there's a framework that I use. It's not, I didn't make it up, but it's similar to what I've heard Pixar uses for their framework for all of their films. And it's, so there I was. That's essentially the opening of a story. I call it context. Then one day, and finally, and what I learned from that was this, right? And that whole middle section is basically this series of challenges that the hero, you or someone overcomes, and then the lesson they learned at the end. And it is probably important to get to the end and have a lesson that you learned, or something and because of that day, I do things differently. And here's what I learned from that. And I would save the
Yeah, so
lesson for
that's
the end, right? Yeah. Like rather than
mm,
say, my family's really strange, um, show, don't tell. So describe the scene first. And then you could say, yeah, my family's really strange. That's just like one of many things, but let the listener discover that.
yeah. I was gonna say is that what you're referring to that everybody talks about as the Pixar structure is not actually the Pixar structure. Is Ken Smith's story spine, which
Oh,
is once upon a time, one day, and because of that, and because of that, and because of that, until finally, and after that day, or ever since that day. So yeah, it's the story spine from Ken Smith. And what you said about how leave the lesson for the end. Yeah, I think I agree. I think the lesson should be left at the end. What I think sometimes is helpful is something I picked up from the guys from Anecdote that we were talking about earlier, is what they call a relevance statement. So
mm-hmm.
instead of
Mm-hmm.
just launching into a story, which is
Right.
absolutely fine to do on a stage, I don't think there's any issue with just launching into the story when you're on stage, or on presentation, but that feels very awkward if you're doing it in conversation. I think somebody
Yeah.
says something, and if your first thing out of your mouth is 5 years ago, blah blah blah, it just seems really weird. So
Yeah.
so I've seen that the relevant statement be something as simple as, well, now that you say that, it reminds me of something that happened to me 5 years ago. Fine, now
Sure.
it sounds
Sure.
okay.
Yeah.
Or yeah, I mean, people can be people can do some pretty unexpected things sometimes. I mean, there was this time last year where, so you kind of just, you're not giving the moral away, you're
Yeah.
just giving maybe the theme. So the
Kind of a
theme is
little.
people do strange things, and then
Yeah.
you're still gonna tell your story. And I don't do that much, but I think that it has one big advantage for people who are not necessarily great storytellers, is it takes away the temptation of finishing and then giving three, four, five lines of this is the moral of the story. Because you
Yeah.
kind of already set it up, so you don't have to to do it at the end. Whereas I think a lot of people do is they just tell the story and then spend, almost the same amount telling you what the story means. I was like, "But then
Yeah.
tell a better story."
Yeah, yeah. Absolutely. I think that sounds like a great advice. And especially I think storytelling's a little bit, like I think at this point people know that storytelling is effective in the business world, right? And yet there's this or anywhere, right? That we're built for story. We're it's one of the oldest forms of human communication. But we don't know exactly how to use it or where to use it. Sure, on stage, but like you just said in a conversation, well, funny you should mention that because 5 years, without sounding a little bit silly. Um, so yeah, I mean, one thing that occurs to me for anyone who's listening and they're sort of just starting at this is I'm just a fan of working with where you are. And just, I advise people to start a story bank. And so start writing down, your stories as they're happening to you on a daily and weekly basis. And I don't mean writing out the full story, but just a phrase or two to remind you of what happened. So you can start collecting stories, but then you can also start to just notice, how are you already telling stories? Because you tell stories, like we just don't. I'm focused on this, so I now see storytelling all around us all the time. But if you're not, then you might think, oh, that's only something that's happening when I'm watching a movie or reading a book. So just notice, oh, I told a story earlier today, and here's how I went into that, and it was fairly natural. So just always looking for that authentic way in.
Now, just before we're done, I wanted to just share something that reading your book, it came back to me, and I'm not sure if this thing that happened makes me sound like a horrible human being or a non-judgmental human being, but I think it will speak to you. Now, I was working as I was working as a financial advisor in, this was 2008, I think, so we have that in common to some extent.
Mhm.
And there was this guy from the London office in my company, and we had a managers meeting. And at some point we're in the meeting, and I just catch him taking some notes, and something just catches my eye, and I'm not sure what it is. And then I pay more attention, and I see it, and I'm like, hold on, one of his hands is really, really big. Like, I'm talking
Mm.
about like baseball glove big. Okay, well,
Oh,
maybe
wow.
not so much, because
Mhm.
that would be monstrous. But like, it's like 1.5 to 2 times the size of what most people's hands are. And I just like, okay, well, I never heard of anything like that. And then I just went up to him and I said, Matt, um, please don't take this the wrong way, but what's the deal with your hands? And he kind of like, obviously, I don't think he took my question very well, and he clammed up and he just had mumbled something like, "Oh, it's just been always been like that," or something like that. And I think you know exactly why I'm telling you that, because you shared in the book how you talked. Didn't you do like a show or a
Yeah.
presentation that's called
Yeah.
Little Hand, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So my question there is, so in this show you were sharing how I think one of your hands is slightly smaller than the other, and
Mhm.
I think I know the answer, but for anyone who's listening, you picked something that a lot of people prefer not to draw attention to, as I guess would have
Mhm.
been the case with Matt, this guy who used to work with me. But you chose to draw attention to it, and you drew a lot of attention to it. The whole thing was about this.
Yeah.
So why did you do that, and why is that something that people should be doing in their storytelling?
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I opened this was another solo performance, Little Hand, and the first line of the performance was going up to the audience and going, "I've got one hand that's a little bit smaller than the other hand. Can you see that? Can you see that?" Um, and then I just went into the story of that, and just, yeah, it's kind of like it was my vulnerability, right? And it is a weakness, you could say, in quotes, a weakness that maybe ends up being a strength. But I just told the story of my experience of that in a somewhat abstract way, but kind of with scenes of being teased a little bit in middle school, and wanting to get away from it, and how I felt. There was one point where I sort of act out like feeling like Quasimodo. It's like, do not look at my hand, and then, but at the end, sort of coming to, and then my left hand, I was always like, oh, my left hand's my strong hand. I've never am left-handed. And it is this dichotomy, right? And then by the end, it was sort of like the two hands coming together, of weakness and strength, and being more together like that. So that's a theme for me, is sort of vulnerability. And I think that it's, yeah, I think that was probably even more than the mango story. I think that was probably the most vulnerable that I've made myself. And I know from reading some Brene Brown that the feeling of vulnerability is really uncomfortable. It's not that you're going to feel great when you're being vulnerable. It will feel uncomfortable. But I think it's important, and I think that we don't need to necessarily divulge every secret challenge that we've had in our lives on the first date, your first performance with an audience, or first meeting or conversation. But so it's not a black and white situation, but if you can edge in the direction of being authentic, sharing your challenges, people will gravitate towards you, because guess what? Everybody that is listening to you is challenged as well. That could be said in any time, but especially now. And if you're not sharing that at all, if you're not giving any hint that you're suffering or being challenged right now, then it's a cognitive dissonance with your listener, because they're struggling. Everyone's struggling right now. And if you're playing it off like you're doing great during the pandemic, during the global pandemic, then people are going to start to kind of feel resentful towards you, whether they realize it or not. That's just my thinking about that. And if you decide to do that, to be a little bit vulnerable, in and honest and authentic in what you do, you're not going to be on the vanguard of this, because there's leaders out there, including Steve Jobs, and Satya Nadella of Microsoft, and many others who are out there telling their vulnerable stories. So I just always encourage people to do that.
I think I would hope that Steve Jobs is still not out there sharing his vulnerable stories. Is that
Well, he is on the
a
internet. Yeah, you could go look at him now.
slightly
That his story,
a slightly
the
different type of
yeah,
story?
yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that no, I completely agree. I mean, I did write a book called Bear, A Guide to Brutally Honest Public Speaking, and the
Yes.
cover is a Clark Kent type of guy opening his shirt and his heart is just visible there.
Yeah.
But the thing I to me is kind of obvious why that story is more impactful than the mango story, because the mango story is a story of loss, and we can relate to that. But the story of, I have this thing about me that really bothers me, that makes me feel ashamed, that makes me feel smaller than other people, and I'm now coming to terms with that. Like, every single person in the world probably has that, and if they
Yeah.
don't, they're probably a bit of a dick, right? So if there's nothing about you that you're a little bit embarrassed about, that maybe you don't want to draw attention to,
Yeah.
then you're a bit of a strange human being. And I would probably guess that after you did that show, or after you rehearsed a ton for that show, if it really bothered you before, it probably doesn't bother you much anymore, if it still does at all,
Yeah,
right?
it's not really something. Yeah, it's not something that it's kind of a minor thing that I don't think about on a regular basis, but I'm actually happy that you brought that up. And yeah, there was some same thing. Somebody came up to me after one of those performances, and they had a disability, and they said, I really related to what your story, and I've experienced some of the things that you've were showing in that performance. So
Yeah, no, I think Brené Brown has has broken the ground on that one, but it's surprising how sometimes it's difficult to convince people that whatever you're doing, even if you're sharing a story of a lot of achievement, you still need to spend more time. I think you said this in the book, right? It doesn't matter if it's a success story, you still need to spend more time where you were struggling to make that a success, because
yeah,
uh, it, if you want someone to help you with a problem, the person who says, I've never really had that problem, but it doesn't sound too difficult, I'm sure I can help you out, is a lot less interesting to you as a guide than the person who goes like,
yeah,
oh man, that is a nightmare. I went through that last year and I hated it, but I figured it out, so I
absolutely.
can help you for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. I don't think my wife would mind me sharing this, but she went through breast cancer treatment in 2018, and now she is launching a group coaching program for people who have been through breast cancer and are ready to kind of move on to the next stage of their lives. And let me tell you, as she's is getting that out there, like people, she's getting a lot of great feedback for like, hey, thank you for sharing your story and for doing this important work, right? And it wouldn't be quite as effective if she had not gone through something like that herself and was vulnerable enough to put that out there.
Yeah, you can't. I don't think Gandalf might work as a guide, or Yoda might work as a guide without us knowing anything about their own fallibilities. But when it
Oh yeah.
comes to when it comes to human beings communicating in the real world through stories, the guide needs to be someone who's gone through, if not the same struggle, but struggles that are
Yeah.
somewhat related to the types of struggles that your audience is going through. Because otherwise, you just come across as a know-it-all, or just someone who's not terribly relatable to the people that you're trying to help, and that would defeat the whole purpose. So
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I know we're wrapping up here, but yeah, just like a lot of actually a lot of business people will say, "Well, they don't need to know my story. This is about them. The customer is the hero." And that's true in your brand story. The customer is the hero and you're Yoda. This was yeah, that's been kind of outlined before. But I would argue the same as you just said there. Like people need to know your story as well, and who you are and what drives you. Otherwise, like, who are you to tell me this? Give me this feedback.
yeah, I don't want to go in another massive tangent, but what I think about that is this confusion between that the story is about the customer. It's not about the customer. It's for the customer. That's different. So you're not saying. I mean, you can tell stories about your customers, but often you are the character of the story, and
Mm,
the whole story is just thought out. Okay, is this going to benefit my customer? How are they going to relate to this? What are they going to learn from it? But you're likely to still be the character often, or someone else is the character, but you're telling it for them. so
mhm.
so what do they need to see from this character, so this is useful for them? And I
Yeah.
think that's a slight change in this whole idea, oh, it's about your customer, that confuses people, because they think they cannot tell their own stories because it should be
Mm.
about the customer. It's like, no, it is for the customer. It's not about the customer.
Point taken. Good observation.
Right. And on that note, if people want to find out more about you, where do you want to point them to?
So I think a good place to start would be to go to storypoweredspeaker.com, and that will take you to the book page of my website, and you can kind of check that out. And then you'll see the rest of the offerings I have on my website, which is normanjbell.com, but you just maybe go to storypoweredspeaker.com. Coaching programs, courses, and more. So yeah, feel free to reach out to me as well at normanjbell.com.
Perfect. Norman, it's been fantastic. Thank you very much for your time today, man.
Thank you so much, Francisco. It's been a pleasure to be here.
All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Take care of yourselves, and until next time.